Namaskar. Thank you, Jadavpur University, JUDE Special Lecture Series, for inviting me to deliver a special lecture in the inaugural session on the topic Conflict, Poetry and Peace. What a pertinent subject it is, given the time that we are going through. Literature, especially poetry, that comes as a panacea, as a driving force to initiate us human beings towards a better living. I'm grateful to the English department of Jadavpur University for organizing this special lecture series, as well as for having given me the opportunity to share my experiences with the speakers on the days, the faculty members of this university, the research scholars, students, and other participants and media. A very good morning to each one of you. When I was invited to deliver this special lecture, I thought about a few subjects, a few topics that can actually encompass this important subject: conflict, poetry, and peace. Things like broken myths and the mended words, poetry as resistance and reconciliation came to my mind. Also, I thought about talking about between the hero and the healer, folklore's poetic journey from violence to harmony. The organizers have already introduced me as a poet and a folklorist, apart from being a professor of English in Indira Gandhi National Open University, as well as the Vice Chancellor of the University, West Bengal. Folklore is my subject of interest and research. I have been working on folk literature, indigenous knowledge systems, Indian knowledge systems since 2 decades or more. I have designed the country's first ever MA in Folklore and Culture Studies with the printed material, which will be nothing less than 20,000 pages, which is open access material for all the students and the folklorists. Also, I have been deeply engaged with the UGC NET examination in folk literature, creating folklore as a separate discipline. There was a time when folklore was kind of an appendix to English literature or other language departments, but I have been very fortunate to be a part of the initiation, the introduction of folk literature as a separate NET examination, thus a separate discipline. When I was invited to talk about conflict, poetry, and peace, the first thing that came to my mind is how indigenous knowledge systems and folk literatures have been instrumental in creating a more inclusive and a flexible society, and my emphasis today will be more on folk poetry. The topic that I have chosen for myself to discuss today is the sword and the lyre, negotiating conflict through the lens of folklore. Before I get into the discourse of negotiation of conflict through the lens of folk poetry, let me put my research questions for today's discussion in a chronological order. The questions that came to my mind when I sat down to do this research were: how does folk poetry function as a form of resistance and reconciliation in the societies affected by conflict? What are the key poetic devices and metaphors used in war poetry to negotiate narratives of peace and conflict? In what ways can poetry serve as an alternative historical record of conflict, offering perspectives absent from official accounts? And then we can take case studies and comparative analysis to do further research on the topic. Questions like: how have poets from the war-torn regions like Palestine, Kashmir, Ireland, used poetry to shape peace discourses. What are the similarities and differences in the use of poetry as a tool for peace building across different cultures and historical contexts? How has poetry been employed in post conflict reconciliation efforts such as truth and reconciliation commissions like in South Africa, etc.? For that matter, we have to go to an interdisciplinary approach towards the socio-political dimensions of poetry. How do modern conflict poets engage with global peace movements? And what impact does their poetry have on policy and activism is a very important question. What role does poetry play in psychological healing and trauma recovery for victims of war and violence? Digitalization is very contemporary. The contemporary relevance of poetry depends on the digital platforms like digital humanities and post-truth. My questions are, how has the rise of digital platforms like social media, spoken word and performances transformed the role of poetry in conflict resolution and peace advocacy? What is the role of translation in making conflict poetry accessible to a global audience? And how does it impact the cross-cultural peace negotiations? To address these questions, my dear students, I have to talk about a few theoretical approaches. I understand that your university has a very rich department, English department, and the theory classes that you all engage are absolutely beneficial for the faculty and the students. So I am sure that when I talk about the theoretical approaches towards peace and conflict resolution, you will be in a position to connect, to associate. Conflict studies examines the causes, dynamics and resolutions of conflict. Poetry as a cultural and artistic response can be analyzed through theories like Marxist literary theory. When you talk about poetry as a means of class struggle and resistance, like Bertolt Brecht's poetry, revolutionary poetry, or you can also think about how conflict poetry exposes power structures and inequality in any given society. Now look at post-colonial theory, where you talk about poetry as an anti-colonial tool. A Clark's Notebook of Return to the Native Land is a good example. The role of indigenous poetry in reclaiming identity after colonial conflicts, like Mahmoud Darwish and the Palestinian poetry, and there are so many other examples which I will come to discuss in due course of my lecture. Also, trauma discourses and memory studies. We talk a lot about Nemo culture today. In memory culture or Nemo culture, we can talk about poetry as a site for collective memory for historical conflicts. For example, Holocaust poetry by Paul Celan. How poetic expression aids in trauma recovery and conflict reconciliation can also be a topic for research today. And then when you talk about poetics of conflict, you have to emphasize on language, form and representation. Initially in the world there were 6 lakh languages, and today there are only 6,000 languages. So what happened to rest of the languages? They died a natural death in the absence of any archiving and documentation. As poets, this is our responsibility, our moral responsibility, to take care of language preservation. We may have to create language archives through the poetic discourses, through the poetic language. Here I remember when I was working on language death as a blog for MA in Folklore and Culture Studies, I had to take extensive interviews with the last speakers of a few dying language groups. Initially, they were not willing to talk about their dying languages. It was a Herculean task for me to convince them that theirs is a dying or an endangered language. Then gradually, when they opened up before me, they started with poetry. They recited some rare poems of their respective languages, which became archives for me in due course of time. If you look at ethnomusicology as historians, I would suggest that it's a very interesting area of research. So Department of English, the scholars of English department, they should get into such kind of research where they have to look into poetic affairs. History was always written by the winner. Now, what happened to the history of the so-called loser? There is actually no one who we should call a loser, so I am putting it within quote unquote. So the history of the loser was basically written by the folklorists, which we take in theoretical terms as ethnomusicology. The students of English literature and the students of history can do some multidisciplinary research together and create ethnomusicological research platforms where the history of a civilization is written through poetry, through folk poetry, and that is what is ethnomusicology in simplistic terms. In due course of my lecture, I will get into the nitty-gritties and the complexities of ethnomusicology for the benefit of the students. Poetry is distinct from other forms of conflict discourses because of its unique aesthetics. Like Bakhtin's dialogism can be applied to discuss poetry as a polyphonic space, as a polyphonic engagement where multiple voices, including those of the oppressor and the oppressed, coexist. Just now we were talking about ethnomusicology. Now look at this. Bakhtin's dialogism also hints at that. How poetry allows marginalized voices to negotiate meanings within the conflict should be the key. I would recommend that the students also look into affect theory, which indicates at the emotional intensity of poetry in shaping public sentiments towards war and peace. Poetic forms like rhyme, rhythm, metaphor, imagery influence the perception of conflict. The tone and the tenure of poetry definitely defines the integrity of any particular poem. Eco-poetics and conflict also can be a subject of war poetry and poetry towards peace. Environmental destructions as a form of conflict is represented in poetry, especially in indigenous poetry on ecological violence. Today we have to think about the role of poetry in advocating for environmental peace. New areas of research and pedagogy are coming in a big way into English disciplines. We are talking about green cultural studies, eco-poetics, blue humanities, ocean humanities, sound culture studies, medical humanities, hospitality, so many, and folk poetry, tribal poetry, so many new areas of research are coming in a big way in English departments, which is definitely a very good news for us. English departments are truly becoming interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary as well as multidisciplinary. We are talking about peace studies and poetic resolutions in our English classrooms. Poetry does not only document and critique conflict but also contributes to peace building efforts. Theorizing this requires engagement with peace studies frameworks like John Gonchung's theories of peace, where negative peace is defined as poetry as a reaction to direct violence, like Wilfred Owen's anti-war poetry, and positive peace as an agent of structural change and reconciliation is also a part of our poetic discourses. For example, Nelson Mandela's use of poetry to foster unity is something that we have been deeply engaged with. The narrative and discourse analysis of poetry can be used as a counter-narrative to dominant war discourses. The role of poetic storytelling in post-conflict truth commissions, for example, South Asian poetry after the apartheid can be an example here. Performance studies and spoken word poetry is equally important. Poetry slams and spoken word as contemporary peace activism is something that the youngsters will definitely connect with. Slam books and poetry slams, and they are creating Instagram reels through poetry or for poetry or even on poetry. The role of oral traditions in conflict resolutions like African groits and peace negotiations can also be talked about in this seminar. A theory of conflict, poetry, and peace must integrate socio-political analysis of conflict theory, aesthetic and literary approaches of poetics and discourse analysis, and practical peace studies through reconciliation frameworks. Poetry is not just a reflection of conflict, but it is an active participant in shaping conflict narratives and peace processes. Now, I will go to my specific topic, conflict and peace studies through folk narratives, with special emphasis on folk poetry. I will talk about how myths and folklore preserve both the trauma and conflict and the longing for peace. My subtopics can be the oral tradition as a vessel of collective memory, poetry as a bridge between historical violence and emotional healing, and we can take case studies from the Mahabharat's lamentations in contradicting to Homer's Iliad. We can talk about themes like from chaos to cosmos, the poetic alchemy of conflict in peace in myth and folklore. Our focus is the transformation of disorder or chaos into order or cosmos through poetic retellings of myth. The role of creation myth in addressing existential conflicts is something that folk theory classrooms are addressing. Poetry as a cosmic force is the theme of the creation myth, and we are talking about destruction to reconciliation through folk poetry. We can make comparative analysis of Hindu scripture Rig Veda, the hymns, and the Norse creation myth, so that we can have comparative world literatures, discourses even in our English classrooms. The songs of blood, hymns, and hope that deal with the dual faces of myth and poetic traditions emphasize on how the same myth can inspire both warlike situation and peaceful contemplation. This is a counter discourse to the discourse that we are talking now. The glorification of heroism versus the tragic cost of war in epics, where folklore is both a propaganda and a protest. The examples can be the dual readings of the Ramayana as a story of conquest and also a story of moral dilemmas. And then when you negotiate conflict through the lens of folklore, you create a symbolic relationship between violence, which is the sword in my lecture, and the artistic expression, which is the lyre, here the folklore, where the poets are both chroniclers and the critiques of war, with special reference to folk poetry. We have to talk about the role of bardic traditions in shaping historical narratives. Now, who doesn't know about folk poems or folk discourses like Khoob ladi mardani wo to Jhansi wali rani thi. During the independence struggle of India, these kind of folk narratives created nationalism. So the role of bardic traditions was very important in shaping the historical narratives. The tensions between glorification and grief in warrior poetry is something that the folk theorists and the folk scholars are coming up with important and interesting researches. Poetry as a resistance and reconciliation is kind of subversion of the traditional myths to challenge the dominant narratives and promote peace. Myth making and myth breaking both are acts of poetic rebellion when it comes to mythic and folkloristic engagements. Dear students, when we talk about folklore, I would emphasize that you should know the thin line of difference, of distinction between mythology, history, and folklore. and classical literatures or classical studies. Do not use these four terms interchangeably, synonymously. There are distinct differences between the four. Rewrite folklore from the marginalized perspectives if you are a folk poet. I will give the example of Dalit and feminist reinterpretations of classical myths in modern Indian poetry, which can be the best example of palace paradigm as a counter discourse to, Sanskritization, which is a counter discourse to palace paradigm. The poetic anatomy of conflict in myth and folklore analyze how myths aestheticize violence and how poetry exposes its raw reality. Folk poetry is extremely raw. It has a raw quality of its own. That is how it can touch the heart. The romanticization of war folklore versus the personal cost in poetic laments is something that we have to give rethinking to. A poet's role in humanizing legendary figures is very, very important. For that matter, you have to do a comparative study of the elegiac tradition in Irish folklore and Indian bhakti poetry. The comparative study can be very interesting that during the same period, Irish folklore and Indian bhakti poetry were going through a similar tradition. They have similar themes, texture, similar content and coherence in both kinds of poetry. There were poetic dialogues between conflict and peace even then. In folk poetry, fire is used as a metaphor for conflict and water is used as a symbol for healing and renewal of poetry and myth. This is what is a part of our researches today in ocean humanities and blue humanities. In blue humanities and in ocean humanities, we discuss the elemental symbolism of water in world folklore, and poetry is taken as a cooling, quote unquote, cooling force in the aftermath of the historical trauma. Trauma studies people are hinting at that. Give the example of water imagery in post-partisan poetry in India, for example. Coming to Indian folk literature, I can give you multiple examples, but one typical example I would like to emphasize here is Babuji Ke Phad from Rajasthan. This folk epic tells the story of Babuji, a Rajput hero who is both a warrior that stands for the shore and a protector of the cows, and dharma that stands for the lyre, the folklore. His valor in battle and his ability to maintain justice showcase the negotiation between war and peace. We can also take the example of Allah Khan of Bundelkhand, where the story of a warrior, in fact the story of the warrior brothers Allah and Udal, who fight fiercely yet often engage in moments of diplomacy and reconciliation, representing the tension between conflict and resolution. Even come to our Panchatantra stories. These fables use wit, the lyre, to resolve the conflicts instead of the brute force, the sword, such as the story of the monkey and the crocodile, where intelligence trumps over aggression. Now, you can also go to European folk literatures. From France, the Song of Roland, it's a medieval poem where war and honor dominate, but also it highlights the role of wisdom and negotiation through characters like Oliver, who advises caution and diplomacy. If you go to Robin Hood ballads from England, Robin Hood, an outlaw, he uses both combat, the sword, and strategy, the lyre, through wit and cunning folk poetry to challenge unjust authority and to negotiate justice for the poor. Coming to Middle Eastern and Persian folk literature, the epic contains both brutal battles and moments of wisdom, such as the story of Rostam and Shora, where misunderstanding leads to tragedy, showcasing the failure of negotiation. And Arabian Nights, 1001 Nights, Seyrzade, the liar, he uses the she uses storytelling to avert her own execution, proving that intellect and diplomacy can triumph over violence. Going to African folk literature, Sandiata, an epic of the old Mali, the story of Sandiata Keita, it portrays both military conquest and the wisdom of a just ruler, emphasizing the balance between war and peace in leadership. The tortoise and the leopard, West African folklore, the tortoise outwits the aggressive leopard, showing that intelligence, which is liar, can defeat brute strength, which is the sword. Coming to East African folklore, the tale of the Heike from Japan chronicles the Genpei War, but also it contains Buddhist themes of impermanence, showing that war leads to suffering and peace is ultimately found through poetry. The Peach Blossoms Spring from China, it's a story of a hidden utopia where people live in harmony, avoiding conflict, a metaphor for choosing peace over war. Folk traditions reflect the tension between conflict and resolution, showing that societies have long grappled with the balance between war and peace, violence and wisdom, the sword and the lyre. Now, coming to the course that I was talking about, MA in Folk Literature, we have taken Oral Epics in India by Stuart H. Blackburn, where we talk about the relationships between the folk and the Sanskrit epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Also, we have emphasized on things like folk poetry, the themes that articulate martial, sacrificial, and romantic rather than solely heroic poetry in folk scenario. We have talked about the recent studies where some African praise poems are epical in nature. And then we have talked about the performers, gods and heroes in the oral epics of Rajasthan. And Stuart Blackburn, he has done very extensive research on the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the folk engagements thereof. In this epic, we find Lakshman is reborn as a protagonist, Papuji, and Ravan is Papuji's chief enemy. However, one should never assume that all oral epics in India strictly adhere to the Sanskrit epic frameworks. John D. Smith, he notes that the only version of the Mahabharata that is performed in Rajasthan is completely different from the original Sanskrit versions. The folk community in Rajasthan has made its own version and is imbued with the local qualities. These folk epics carry new bearings with them, which has no connection with the original version of the folklore. So folk is ever evolving, it keeps changing. And then in Tamil Nadu, in the Congo area, the Ananmar stories of folk poetry, they take place in the 15th century folk discourses. And this is, martial folk epic in the poetic form. There are examples where the male audience usually join the male singers during the performances. So gender discourse can also come here as a part of your discussion. And in another chapter in the folk poetry section, we have talked about the Awakened Wind, the oral poetry of Indian tribes by Sitakant Mahapatra. Sitakant Mahapatra, and also we have taken, comparative studies like Varied Elwin's folk songs of Chhattisgarh, his folk songs of Michael Hills, and then W.G. Archer's The Blue Grove, the poetry of the Hurons, the Dog and the Leopard, and the Hills of Flute. So many folk poetic texts have been discussed where the basic theme is peace, religious faith, traditional values in folk poetry. And in this text, particularly the Awakened Wind, the oral poetry of Indian tribes by Sitakant Mahapatra, he has talked about the Niyamgiri hills of Odisha, how the Kond tribal groups